I think it's not unfair to say that quite a lot of you are scientists in the room. So I have to forewarn you, things are going to get slightly subjective, illogical, and a wee bit fuzzy around the edges because I come from the School of Arts. Okay. Um, my talk is entitled Failing Better, and I'm kind of borrowing from the Irish writer Samuel Beckett. It might be better described as failing better in the creative process, because in a sense, what I'm going to argue for through a slight case study of my own research and practice is for the benefits of failure. And when I was a student, lots of people used to come in and give us talks about their practices, and they just used to show us all the highlights, the amazing stuff. And even then, I was really suspicious of that. I kept thinking, well, where's the stuff that fell between the cracks? Where's the stuff that didn't go right? It never rang true to me. So when I give talks to people like you, to fellow students, I start off by showing some of the worst things I've made. And they can be for aesthetic reasons. They might be because there's some technical imperfection. They might be, in this case, at the time, this went in a shopping centre and it had the highest footfall for one of my works ever. And at this stage, I was making these site-specific inflatables, and this sculpture inflated and it looked like a giant cat bum. So I had the horrendous experience of having about 3,000 people walk by my giant cat bum sculpture every day for about 3 months. The next thing that went really wrong, this was a project in Denmark by an organisation called Sculpture by the Sea. I spent about 4 months making this thing. It was quite large. It's about 40 meters across, composed of two separate objects, and went over, saw it on the top of the thing, on top of this restaurant. Next day was International Press Day. As you can probably tell from this photograph here, the weather started changing. I thought, oh dear, this doesn't look good. And then I sort of turned around, and in from the sea came this horrendous storm and basically tore it to pieces. This was despite having loads of ballast and loads of chains and all sorts of stuff to try and remedy this. And basically, that was an utter total disaster. The next terrible thing I've done was this, where I misunderstood the consequences of air pressure and volume. So what I've come to learn over the years is that inflatables work really well the larger they are. The bigger the circumference of the tube, the better it works, the more consistent form you get. So this was probably 2013, 2014, and here's me repeating the same error about 5 years later. So that was another lesson I didn't manage to learn. So my own work is perpetuated by failure, but I will hopefully go on to explain why I think that's really beneficial, and particularly why I think that's really important and useful for students to learn. So I'm interested in, I think that it has more universal applications for anybody doing any experimental work, is a kind of openness to things going wrong. Now, I am not alone in artistic terms in thinking about work about failure. Lots of contemporary artists have directly made works about failure. This is Roman Sigonetti's Ramp, which is a performance, and as you can sort of see what happens as a consequence of driving up there. Now, this is Simon Starling, whose work I will not attempt to pronounce it quite a lot, but I will tell you he's quite a conceptual artist, and he does various projects. He did a thing where he went and mined the ore for aluminium and then smelted it and then cast it into a bicycle and then cycled the bicycle to somewhere of significance. In this case, he made a steam-powered boat. Now, of course, if you have a steam turbine, steam engine, you need to power that somehow, don't you? Well, they took the obvious and wise decision to start using the boat itself, with the relatively obvious consequences of failure that I think would scare most of the automotive and engineering side of things. There are other forms of failure. This is a more recent. This is Tanya Bruguera, whose work 10,142,926. It was a piece about the migration of peoples, and this was the figure that they came up with. How many people have been displaced, how many migrants have gone. The premise of this work was the floor was painted with this heat-sensitive paint. And if people worked together, collaboratively and collectively, they could reveal this portrait of a Syrian refugee who was now living in London. So there's this idea of people coming together. So it was both, so people could essentially fail to reveal the portrait, but it was all about transforming a kind of concept, a discussion, an ideation of a policy, and transforming that into an art. Again, you can kind of see here, then obviously people were free to do their own stuff. There are various examples of artists who use failure in the making process, or there's a kind of inbuilt failure in the work. This is Walter Maria, who made a sculpture called the Lightning Field, and this is out in the desert in New Mexico. And it's essentially a grid of stainless steel poles. And most of the time, it doesn't conduct electricity down the ground. It's essentially a perpetual state of failure. And very occasionally it works. And very occasionally it works, somebody might see that work. Another artist, Saipo Qiang, very interesting Chinese artist living in America. He does a lot of stuff with gunpowder, did some really amazing gunpowder drawings, does fireworks. But this is his piece, The Sky Ladder, and it was the idea of taking a stairway up to heaven, as you can now see. This is the fourth iteration of it. The first three iterations, which were at major, I have to say, major art biennales, museum events, they all failed. They just didn't work. So it took them 4 attempts to actually get this to work successfully. There is, for those interested, quite an interesting documentary about it on Netflix. There are other examples where artists essentially destroy to create. This is Cornelia Parker's Cold Dark Matter, an exploded view. So she went to the British Army with a shed and asked them to blow it. And they did. And then she reconstructed it. And as you can see here, you get that sense of that kind of chaos and the explosion. And it's quite dramatic to see it because it's a single light bulb in. So you've got all the shadows of the objects on the wall. So there's an inherent use, a destructive process to essentially recreate something. Equally, she's used steamrollers. So this is a reference to the biblical 30 pieces of silver, where she ran over all these items of tableware to create the installation. So, what failing brings, or this idea of failing better? I think what's really important as well, actually, I'm going to talk, some of these artists, you know, I'm not alone in thinking that it's a really important part of an artistic process. The recent Turner Prize winner, Lubina Hamid, says you can't succeed at a work of art unless you dance with failure. John Baldessari says art comes out of failure. You have to try things out. You can't sit around terrified of being incorrect, saying I won't do anything until I do a masterpiece. There's a very notion of just trying something out. I think particularly, you know, students, particularly coming from education system in England, very reticent to do that. You try selling them the idea that failure is useful and that things that don't go to plan and are unexpected, they might have some more resonances than the things that they plan to do. It's quite hard to sell. So I think in that we are, you know, we're interested in the psychology of the students and the language we use to transmit some of these ideas. Again, Carlos Costa, great Cuban dancer, experimentation is the lifeblood of art and there's no warranty. You shouldn't be afraid to fail. In fact, the only way the artist will fail is if they don't try. You just have to have a go. Now, I think part of that is having an open mindset to the idea of failure and the possibilities of failing. Lucy Lafayette wrote about Chris Burden, who's an American performance artist, and one of the more notorious acts was he had somebody shoot him in the arm. And she wrote, his practice acts out the simple question, what happens if you question? Making the risk of failure space for opportunity. Well, you might ask the opportunity to do what? Well, why not make a steamroller fly? Yeah. Okay, so to slightly go full circle, I'm going to bring it back to all of my failures. So that was a fairly catastrophic one. Things do occasionally go right. So this is a project, I make site-specific inflatables. This was a project in Sydney just before Christmas, or just after Christmas actually. And the work responds to the building. It takes people around the building, and it basically takes them on a journey. It's quite large, it's about 46 meters long by 20 meters. To give you some context of how big that is, that's it when I tested it in one of our halls. The premise is you can't see it from a single viewpoint. You actually have to move around this thing. It's temporal, it's experiential. And I've done this in different places in different ways, often reacting to the nature of the space, kind of more industrial fabric for the industrial space, to various deconsecrated churches. However, all of this work comes from a failure, or perhaps I should be more honest and say a lie or an exaggeration. Because about 20 years ago, I got shortlisted for a sculpture prize, and I said, yes, I can make this, and I can make it out of clear resin, and I can do a massive cast of this, and it can have a thin skin. And technically, it's possible to do this. You can do it through rotational molding, but certainly not within the budget that's permissible. Obviously, that didn't work out. But then, about a year later, I suddenly had this idea, do you know what? I can make this, but I can make it a different way. I can make it as an inflatable. So this is like a sealed inflatable, kind of giant balloon. And it has that quality of a kind of inside and an inside. It's got sort of two insides, if that makes sense. Do you see the way I play fast and loose with science there? So again, it came out of what was essentially a failure. How can we perpetuate failure? Drawing's really good, drawing's cheap. One of the things I often do is I make hundreds of drawings, most of them garbage, most of them get thrown away. That's something we share with students. Again, they want they want to put in 2 hours of effort and 2 hours of reward. It's human nature. You want that, you want to do well. But I think you have to find ways to allow them to understand. I think perhaps here's where some of the commonalities are, that being open to things going wrong is actually how you can develop your language, how you can develop your artistry, and I think that might apply elsewhere. So the question I'm often asking them is your reluctance to fail hindering your creative process? The idea that we're not trying to fail, right? We're not actively trying to do something that's rubbish, but sometimes those byproducts of failing can become new techniques. They the new findings, the new products. Okay, so for those interested, if you want to read about it, hear about it, it's a really good talk on YouTube by Ken Robinson, who was a kind of educationist, died a couple of years ago, and he talks a lot about creativity in schools, which is conditioning the students that are coming to us. And I'm just going to finish off with this final quote here, just to convey the nebulous nature of arts education and arts practice, which is the creative process is like panning for gold. There might be a nugget in there somewhere, and it's your job to get on your hands and knees and sift through the dirt and grind to find it. You might put however here. And the moment you're absolutely 110% sure you've hit gold is probably the moment it's time to start panning elsewhere. So I think for me, we can possibly have some questions and discussions here, that the connected ideas are essentially psychology, the linguistics about how we talk about failure, not just think about it. I think it connects to pedagogy, curriculum and educational policies. And in terms of a certain extent, there might be connections to coaching and confidence, which again sort of leads on to notions of well-being and resilience, which I think possibly connects back to sport there. So I hope we've gone full circle. And, yeah, there we go. Any questions?